Under a quiet grass field in Alabama, something was waiting to prove a century of archaeology wrong. For decades, Moundville has been ranked as America's second largest ancient city, right behind Cahokia. That ranking was never really about how many people lived there. It was about who is still fighting over who's buried there. The University of Alabama built its reputation on this site and for years quietly classified thousands of ancestors as unidentifiable, avoiding the one question that mattered most. Archaeologist Vincus Stepanitis spent decades studying the bones and the pottery, and what he found didn't just complicate the population count. It suggested Moundville wasn't the thriving city everyone assumed. It was something closer to a graveyard, kept alive by outsiders long after the town itself had emptied. This is Moundville on the Black Warrior River in Hale County, Alabama, a site still hiding 86% of itself underground. Walk the park today, and the scale is obvious before anyone explains it to you. The plaza stretches wide and flat, ringed by grass-covered earthworks that block out the modern tree line. Museum cases inside the Jones Archaeological Museum hold engraved pottery and shell gorgets pulled from these same mounds, lit and labeled like the treasures they are. It feels finished. It feels like a story that has already been told in full. 29 earthen mounds rise around a plaza that was not natural. Mississippian engineers leveled it by hand, moving basket after basket of dirt until the ground itself became a stage. The mounds themselves range from small platforms barely 3 feet high to towering earthworks reaching 57 feet, built in stages, layer packed on layer over generations. A log palisade, reinforced with bastions, wrapped around 3 sides of the settlement. The river guarded the fourth. The whole town covered roughly 185 acres, a footprint deliberate enough that archaeologists still describe it as planned from the first shovel of dirt. By the year 1300, this stood as the largest town in what is now Alabama. It earned National Historic Landmark status in 1964, a place on the National Register 2 years later, and today draws close to 40,000 visitors a year to a museum most of them assume tells the whole story. That comparison to Cahokia is not clickbait. It is real, and it has held up in academic literature for decades. But comparisons like that carry weight, and weight invites scrutiny. Cahokia, across the Mississippi from modern St. Louis, is recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site, the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico, covering nearly 1,600 hectares and including roughly 120 mounds at its height. At its peak, between the years 1050 and 1150, UNESCO's own estimate puts the population somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people. Monk's Mound alone, the largest prehistoric earthwork built anywhere in the Americas, rises roughly 100 feet and covers more than 5 hectares at its base. That is the standard Moundville is measured against. Cahokia didn't last either. Its decline began after roughly 1200, and by 1350 to 1400, the great city had emptied out entirely, for reasons researchers still debate: drought, exhausted soil, political collapse, some combination of all three. That decline is part of what makes the Cahokia comparison so loaded. Whatever happened to Moundville, people assumed, must have followed a similar arc, a thriving city that eventually faded. The public television series, Discovering Alabama, has spent decades reinforcing that image for state audiences, presenting Moundville as proof that Alabama once held its own alongside the greatest population centers of ancient North America. It is a point of real regional pride. It is also, as it turns out, a simplification nobody had seriously stress-tested. Moundville, when researchers actually tried to count its people rather than its prestige, produced a very different number. Somewhere close to 1,000 residents lived inside the palisade. Some estimates push that as high as 2,000 at the absolute peak. Not 20,000, not even close. Archaeologists don't pull numbers like that from thin air. They count excavated house floors, estimate how many families each one likely held, and multiply that against how much of the town has actually been dug. Then check the math against how dense the burial population looks by comparison. Every version of that math, run by different researchers over different decades, landed in roughly the same range. A supporting population of roughly 10,000 farmed the surrounding river valley, but inside the walls, in the beating heart of the second Cahokia, the population was a fraction of the fame. That is the first crack, and it is the kind of detail a museum label rarely explains in full. Here is the second, stranger one. Only about 14% of Moundville has ever been excavated. 14% after more than a century of digging, cataloging, and museum construction. In 2015, a team of researchers ran a landscape-scale, magnetometer, and gradiometer survey across the site, instruments that read magnetic disturbances in the soil without moving a single shovel of earth. Every buried hearth and collapsed post leaves a faint signature behind, and a machine dragged across a grid can't find it in an afternoon. The results, published in the journal American Antiquity, were not a minor footnote. The survey mapped more than 450 probable buildings that no excavation, no field crew, and no century of archaeology had ever recorded. Nearly 5 times everything found by hand in 100 years of digging, sitting quietly under the grass the entire time. So a site famous enough to be measured against the largest Native American city ever built has spent most of its existence essentially unread. And the piece of it that has been read does not match the fame it was given. That is where this story actually starts, not with a new discovery, but with an old, respected claim that starts to wobble the moment you look closely at the numbers behind it. To understand why the numbers don't add up, you have to go back to how this site was found, dug, sold, stolen, and studied, because almost none of it happened the way you'd expect from a place this important. It also helps to understand what, second only to Cahokia, was actually being measured against inside Alabama itself. Moundville isn't the state's only mound complex. Bottle Creek, out in the Mobile-Tensaw Delta, holds 18 mounds reachable only by boat. The Bessemer site near Birmingham was excavated and largely destroyed in the 1930s. None of them come close to Moundville's scale or its artistic output. The engraved pottery, the effigy vessels, the ceremonial imagery so distinctive that collectors and museums still identify a Moundville style on site. That artistic reputation is real, and it is part of why the Cahokia comparison stuck for so long. Prestige built on craftsmanship is not the same thing as prestige built on population, but for 100 years, almost nobody separated the two. Moundville was founded around the year 1120 on a bluff overlooking the Black Warrior River in what is now Hale County, Alabama. It did not grow slowly out of a scattered village. The evidence suggests it was planned, a deliberate act of construction, a leveled plaza surrounded by mounds arranged with intention, a walled town built to project power along a river corridor. For roughly 2 centuries, it functioned as a political and religious center for a wide swath of the Mississippian Southeast, trading, marrying, and warring with communities scattered across what is now the American South. Then, sometime after 1300, something changed, and for most of the 20th century, nobody dug carefully enough to notice. The first major excavation came from a private collector named Clarence B. Moore, who arrived in 1905 and again in 1906, traveling the Southeast's river systems aboard his own steamboat, the Gopher. Moore was not an archaeologist by modern standards, though he published his findings and worked through the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia, enough institutional cover to make his digging look legitimate. He opened mounds, pulled out pottery, engraved shell gorgets, and ceremonial objects, and shipped a significant share of what he found back to Philadelphia. Alabama had no meaningful protection for its archaeological sites at the time, no permitting process, no requirement to leave anything behind. Moore was not unusual. Across the Southeast, private collectors were opening mound after mound in these years, treating burial grounds as inventory, and entire state collections were being scattered into museums and parlors, hundreds of miles from where they were dug. The state's response came a decade later, in 1915, when lawmakers passed an antiquities law, largely because men like Moore had shown exactly how easily a state's buried history could be removed and never returned. That should have been the end of casual removal. It wasn't. Between 1930 and 1941, the Alabama Museum of Natural History ran an excavation at Moundville on a scale nobody had attempted before, using labor from the Civilian Conservation Corps under the direction of archaeologist David D. Jarnett. Crews moved fast. They moved in volume. Thousands of burials and artifacts came out of the ground during those years, and the sheer speed of the operation meant documentation standards fell short of what modern archaeology would demand. The same CCC crews built the museum that still stands on the site today, the Jones Archaeological Museum, opened in 1939, which means every visitor who walks through its doors is standing on ground excavated under conditions nobody would defend now. Photographs from the period show trenches cut straight through mound layers, crews working in long rows, wheelbarrows hauling dirt away almost as fast as it could be screened for artifacts. Field notes were vague in places where they needed to be precise. The line between when someone lived here and when someone was buried here was never firmly drawn, and that gap in the record would resurface decades later in a much more serious argument. For a long time, that argument stayed buried along with everything else. What surfaced instead, in March of 1980, was a very different kind of disappearance. Thieves broke into the Erskine Ramsey Archaeological Repository on the Moundville grounds and walked out with 264 pottery vessels, roughly 1/5 of the entire collection, and by some estimates nearly 70% of the museum quality pieces. At the time, the loss was valued near $1 million. Today, closer to $3 million. The FBI investigated, the trail went cold, and the university did not make the theft public until 2003, more than 2 decades after the vessels vanished, a silence that outlasted an entire career in archaeology. Think about that timeline for a second. A site ranked with Cahokia, a collection stripped by 1/5, a public that didn't know for 23 years. In 2018, a group calling itself the Associates for the Return of Moundville Artifacts offered a $25,000 reward for information. Not long after, 3 ceremonial vessels were anonymously returned, passed back through an intermediary with no explanation attached. The rest, 261 vessels, are still missing, presumably sitting in private collections, unlabeled, their origin known only to whoever is keeping them. Meanwhile, a separate and far heavier question had been sitting in storage the entire time, not about pottery, but about people. For decades, the University of Alabama classified thousands of ancestral human remains recovered from Moundville as culturally unidentifiable. That classification matters legally. Under federal repatriation law, remains that cannot be tied to a present-day tribe do not have to be returned. Investigative reporting, most notably a ProPublica investigation, later documented exactly how that classification held for years, despite what looks in hindsight like an obvious connection to Muskogean-speaking peoples, the ancestors of the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Muskogee Creek nations, among others. The same reporting found the university had, at one point, planned to CT scan and re-inventory the remains before any decision on their status. CT scanning skeletal remains is a real standard tool in modern bioarchaeology. It can reveal age, sex, old injuries, even diet, without ever opening a box. Used carefully, it can help confirm affiliation faster. Proposed as a new prerequisite, after decades of delay, it read to descendant communities as one more procedure standing between them and their dead, a process that would have taken years longer, while descendants kept waiting. Some of those remains, reporters found, had been stored in paper bags. Moundville was never an isolated case. The same reporting placed it inside a much larger national pattern. Museums and universities across the country were sitting on hundreds of thousands of ancestral remains, decades after a 1990 federal law called NAGPRA required institutions receiving federal funding to identify who those remains belonged to and return them. The law had teeth on paper. In practice, culturally unidentifiable became a label institutions could apply and rarely had to defend, and it could sit on a set of remains indefinitely, with no clock forcing a resolution. Moundville's collection was simply one of the largest and most consequential examples of how that loophole was used. A rushed excavation, a missing collection, a concealed theft kept quiet for 23 years, a classification that quietly avoided a legal obligation for decades. None of that, by itself, proves a conspiracy. Institutions protect their collections, their funding, their reputations. That is not unique to Moundville. But stack these details together, and a pattern starts to form. Every one of them points toward the same uncomfortable habit. Treat the site as an object to study, and treat the questions about who it actually belonged to as a problem to defer. It's worth asking plainly who benefited from that deferral. A university keeps a world-class research collection intact for scholars and tourism revenue. A century of careers gets built on a second Cahokia label without anyone having to reconcile it against tribal claims. None of that requires bad intentions on any single person's part. It only requires a system where the people asking the hardest questions were, for decades, the ones with the least power to force an answer. And 200 miles away on a different river, that same habit had already produced something far worse. In 2001, on the Coosa River in Wetumpka, Alabama, archaeologists working under Auburn University exhumed 57 sets of human remains and thousands of associated objects from a site called Hickory Ground, known to the Muskogee people as Otsi-Vipofa. Hickory Ground was the last capital of the Muskogee Creek Nation before federal removal forced them onto the Trail of Tears in the 1830s, following the Treaty of Cusseta. It sits on the National Register of Historic Places. In 1980, the Porch Band of Creek Indians purchased the 34-acre site using a federal historic preservation grant, a grant that came with a written promise to protect it. That protective covenant expired around the year 2000. Within a year, the excavation happened. Soon after, a casino went up. Wind Creek, Wetumpka now stands on ground where 57 ancestors were removed from the earth. Picture the ground itself. Slot machines and casino lighting now sit within view of the same soil where 57 people were lifted out of the earth in 2001 and driven away for study. This is not a rumor. It is documented in federal court filings, and it connects directly back to the questions Moundville had already raised about who gets to decide what happens to the Mississippian dead. So, the origin story of the second Cahokia isn't a straight line from discovery to museum wing. It's 120 years of speed, extraction, quiet losses, and decisions made about human remains by institutions that were not the descendants of the people in the ground. And underneath all of that noise sat the real archaeological puzzle nobody had actually solved. What kind of place was Moundville really? During the centuries, it mattered most. That question is where the science finally catches up with the suspicion. The 2015 Remote Sensing Survey wasn't just about finding buildings. It was run by researchers Jared Davis, Chester Walker, and John Blitz, part of the university's long-running early Moundville archaeological project, using magnetometry and ground-penetrating instruments to read the soil the way a doctor reads a scan. Every buried hearth, every collapsed post, every burned floor leaves the faint magnetic signature behind, invisible to the eye, but visible to the machine. The team didn't just trust the readings blind. They ran a handful of test excavations against the strongest anomalies first, confirming that what the instruments were picking up really were house floors and fire pits, not geological noise. Once that method was validated, they laid the survey grid across the wider landscape, section by section, turning a town that had been mapped by hand for a century into a set of glowing anomaly overlays on a screen. The pattern that emerged was staggering. More than 450 likely structures, spread well beyond the mounds everyone already knew about, sitting in fields that had never been touched by a shovel. For a moment, That discovery seemed to settle the population debate in the opposite direction. Maybe Moundville really was bigger than anyone had estimated. Maybe the low population figures were wrong. Maybe this was the Cahokia rival after all, just hiding under the grass. That would have been the easy, satisfying answer. It isn't the one the evidence actually supports. Because the deeper problem wasn't how many buildings existed, it was when people were actually using them. Archaeologist Vinkus Stepanitis, working through decades of ceramic-based chronology and laid out in detail in the book A New History of Moundville, found something that did not fit the simple story of a booming town holding steady for centuries. The debris of daily life, the broken pottery, the discarded tools, the ordinary trash that piles up wherever people actually live, clustered heavily in the earliest phase of Moundville's history in the 12th and 13th centuries. But the burials told a different story. A large share of the graves date to a later period, after the town's residential footprint appears to have shrunk. People were not just dying at Moundville in those later centuries. In many cases, they appear to have been brought there from smaller outlying settlements, specifically to be buried in ground that had already stopped functioning as a living town. Read that again, because it reverses everything the plaque tells you. Moundville may not have been a growing, thriving Mississippian metropolis for 200 continuous years. It may have exploded fast, functioned as a true population center for a relatively short window, and then, as residents dispersed outward into smaller farming communities across the valley, the site itself did not die. It transformed. It became something closer to sacred ground, a place the living no longer occupied in large numbers but still returned to, generation after generation, to bury their dead. This is where archaeologists like Vernon Knight and Stepanitis have argued, in a body of work later expanded in the volume Rethinking Moundville and its hinterland, for a genuinely different model of what Moundville was. Not simply a chiefdom's capital that slowly declined, but a planned ceremonial center that, after its first 2 centuries, functioned primarily as a necropolis. A city of the dead, maintained by people who no longer lived inside its walls. That reinterpretation remains a live academic debate. Not settled fact, some researchers push back on how sharply the transition happened, and how much residential population actually remained late into the site's history. But the shift in framing matters enormously, because it explains a contradiction that used to make no sense: how a second Cahokia could have such a small resident population and such an enormous sacred footprint of burials and mounds. The 450 unrecorded structures the 2015 survey found do not resolve this cleanly either. Some almost certainly represent the earlier, denser occupation, proof the town really was larger and busier in its opening centuries than the excavated sample alone suggested. Others may represent something closer to seasonal or ceremonial use tied to that later necropolis phase, structures used briefly, by pilgrims and mourners, not permanent households. Without excavating them, nobody can say for certain which is which. And remember, 86% of the site remains unexcavated. The magnetometer can tell you a building exists. It cannot tell you, on its own, who built it, who used it, or when. There is a reason bringing the dead back to an emptied town makes sense, rather than sounding strange. Pilgrimage to ancestral or sacred ground is a documented pattern across Mississippian and many other pre-industrial societies. The living travel to bury their dead where the dead already belong, even if nobody lives there full-time anymore. If Moundville functioned that way after 1300, the site would not look abandoned in the archaeological record. It would look exactly like what excavators found: heavy on burials, thinner on evidence of everyday domestic life. The mismatch that used to look like a contradiction becomes, under this model, the expected signature of a place that had shifted from home to shrine. The survey did not just add a number to a report, it rewrote the priority list for every future excavation at Moundville, telling researchers exactly which quiet corners of grass are worth the cost and years of careful digging that real archaeology requires. So the test that was supposed to answer the population question ended up complicating it instead. It didn't just count buildings. It forced a reckoning with 100 years of assumptions. The assumption that ancient cities grow, peak, and slowly fade in place. The assumption that a burial ground and a living town are the same thing. The assumption that second only to Cahokia meant something close to Cahokia in scale. None of those assumptions survive contact with the data intact. This wasn't a story about a city that quietly shrank. It was a story about a city that changed what it was for, and about a century of archaeology that mistook a graveyard's fame for a living population size. And that distinction between the people who built a place and the people who now decide what happens to what's buried in it is exactly the fight that has moved in the last few years out of the archive and into federal court. In November of 2021, the federal NAGPRA Review Committee, the body that oversees repatriation claims under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, examined the evidence tying Moundville's ancestral remains to present-day Muskogean-speaking tribes. Its conclusion was direct. A preponderance of evidence supported cultural affiliation. 7 tribes had formally petitioned for the return of what was then estimated at close to 5,900 remains and their associated funerary objects, remains the University of Alabama had spent decades labeling unidentifiable. Raylan Butler of the Muskogee Nation's Historic and Cultural Preservation Department and Ian Thompson of the Choctaw Nation were among the voices who pushed the case forward, arguing that Moundville is at least as closely affiliated with Muskogean-speaking peoples as Plymouth Colony is to the United States. Nobody, they were pointing out, would call Plymouth Colony's connection to American history unidentifiable. For descendant communities, the fight was never really about paperwork. It was about whether an institution would keep treating their ancestors as evidence instead of as family. That ruling didn't end the story quietly. It set off a process that culminated in July of 2024 in what the University of Alabama itself described as likely the single largest repatriation of ancestral remains in the history of the federal law, not the original estimate of roughly 5,900, but 10,245 individuals, along with 1,520 lots of funerary objects, returned to 11 tribal nations, including the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, the Chickasaw Nation, the Muskogee Nation, and the Seminole Tribe of Florida. The physical reburial took place that April. Ancestors who had spent up to a century in drawers and storage boxes finally returned to the ground, this time with their own descendants present to do it. It is worth sitting with that number for a moment. 10,245 people, held in university storage, in some cases in paper bags, while their descendants spent decades being told the connection couldn't be proven. It was proven. It had likely been provable for a very long time. But repatriation at Moundville, as significant as it was, did not close the larger conflict this story keeps circling back to. It only made the silence at Hickory Ground harder to ignore. The lawsuit over the 57 remains exhumed from Hickory Ground in 2001 had already been working through the federal court system for over a decade by the time Moundville's remains went home. The Muskogee Nation, along with Hickory Ground Tribal Town and Mecco George Thompson, first sued in 2012, naming the Porch Band of Creek Indians, the Department of the Interior, and Auburn University, alleging violations of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and other federal protections. A district court dismissed the case in 2021 on sovereign immunity grounds. The argument that tribal sovereign status shielded the Porch Band from being sued over what happened on land it owned. For a moment, that looked like the end of it. It wasn't. In October 2024, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals vacated that dismissal and sent the case back down for a full claim-by-claim review. The court's language was pointed. Sovereign immunity, the judges wrote, is not a license to destroy the sacred places and graves of other sovereign tribal nations. At oral argument that September, attorney Mary Catherine Nagel, representing the Muskogee Nation, described what happened at Hickory Ground in blunt terms, they dug up 57 Muskogee relatives, put them in bags, and sent many of them off to Auburn University for scientific study, and that, she argued, directly violates federal law. Principal Chief David Hill has continued to press the case as a matter of the nation's own history returning to court, not a closed chapter. In January of 2025, the Muskogee Nation filed a third amended complaint before Judge Myron H. Thompson, adding new allegations about additional construction at the site as recently as 2023. As of this telling, the case is still moving through the federal courts, with no final ruling on whether the porch band's sovereign status protects it from the underlying claims. Nobody watching this case expects a fast resolution. Federal Indian law cases involving sovereign immunity routinely take years to resolve, and this one has already outlasted the original excavation by more than 2 decades. The porch band has consistently pushed back. Spokeswoman Kristen Helmich and Vice Chair Robert McGee have both described the case as an attack on their own sovereignty as a federally recognized tribe, and pointed out that 17 acres at Hickory Ground, including the sacred ceremonial ground itself, were set aside for preservation when the casino was built. This is not a simple story of villains and victims. It's 2 sovereign tribal nations, one of them the ancestral community itself, disagreeing in federal court in 2025 over what happened to 57 sets of human remains removed from ground both sides agree is sacred. Which brings the story back to where it started, and to why the population count was never really the point. A site ranked second only to Cahokia turns out to have housed a fraction of Cahokia's population, but that undercount doesn't diminish Moundville. It exposes how badly the fame outran the fieldwork. A century of excavation missed nearly 5 times more buildings than it found. A theft went unreported for 23 years, and most of what was stolen has never come home. A university held thousands of ancestors under a legal label that took decades and outside pressure to overturn. And 200 miles away, on a different river, the same unresolved question, who decides what happens to the Mississippian dead, is still sitting in front of a federal judge. None of this proves the wildest version of the story, the one where a hidden metropolis is waiting under the fields to rival Cahokia after all. The honest evidence doesn't support that, but it does make the simple version, the plaque version, the second largest city headline without any of the context underneath it much harder to defend. The real discovery here was never a lost population number. It was a lost accounting of who Moundville actually belonged to, and how long institutions were willing to let that question stay unanswered. Cahokia emptied out and was left to the prairie. Moundville emptied out and became a place people kept coming back to. 2 cities, ranked together for a century, and it turns out their real kinship was never about crowd size at all. It was about what a place becomes once the living leave and only the dead, and the arguments over them remain. Go back to the plaza at Moundville now, right at dusk, when the mounds cast long shadows across grass that still covers 86% of everything that happened here. The museum label hasn't changed in years. It still says second only to Cahokia, still lists the mound count, the acreage, the founding date, all true, all incomplete. Somewhere in storage nearby sit the last unreturned pieces of a collection stripped by a fifth in 1980, still missing, still unaccounted for. On the Coosa River, 100 miles northeast, 57 relatives are still waiting on a federal docket in a case that isn't finished for a court to decide whether a casino built over their grave can stand. Underneath the grass at Moundville, 450 structures nobody has excavated are still sitting exactly where the magnetometer found them, waiting for someone to decide they're worth the dig. The mounds aren't finished revealing what they hold, neither is the argument over who gets to decide.